It was a night like no other, yet one could scarcely tell the difference if one was standing in the grand halls of an ancient palace. The torches flickered, sending shadows dancing across high stone walls adorned with faded frescoes of gods, kings, and battles long past. Somewhere deep within, beyond the polished floors and the echo of hushed footsteps, a presence lingered, a subtle weight, a cold whisper that seemed to move with the very air. It was not spoken of openly, yet every servant, every chamberlain, and every courtier knew, in some unspoken way, that the corridors were alive with more than human intent. The air carried a tension, so delicate that a candle's flicker seemed a warning, a signal of eyes unseen, watching, judging, waiting. It was in this quiet, almost imperceptible space that the story of the demon begins, a force that would haunt kings and kingdoms alike, threading its way through history like an invisible, malevolent river. Imagine, for a moment, walking these corridors yourself. Your footsteps echo softly, and each shadow seems to twitch, as if remembering stories that have been whispered across centuries. The tapestries, though still vibrant in color, carry the weight of countless secrets, tales of triumph and terror, of celebrations held in the presence of fear, and of moments when the invisible hand of dread shaped decisions that would alter the fate of empires. In this silence, one can almost feel the pulse of history, as though the very stones are whispering, sharing glimpses of what came before, of the lives touched by an unseen darkness that no amount of gold or power could dispel. This darkness is not merely myth or legend, it is an imprint on the human soul, a reminder that even kings, elevated above the common crowd, were never beyond the reach of fear. Throughout time, rulers have been seen as larger-than-life, embodiments of strength, wisdom, and divine favor. Yet, behind the veneer of their grandeur, many harbored deep-seated fears, vulnerabilities that could be manipulated by advisors or magnified by the shadows of their own minds. It is in this tension between visible power and invisible terror that our story truly begins. The demon that haunted ancient kings was not a mere figment of imagination, it was a presence that seemed to know their weaknesses, their ambitions, their deepest anxieties. Whether it was whispered in the dark corners of the royal library, hinted at by trembling priests, or suggested in omens carved into sacred walls, its influence was undeniable. And it is precisely this mix of fear and fascination, dread and awe, that drew countless generations into a cycle of myth and reality intertwined. Consider the night sky above these ancient kingdoms. Stars glimmered faintly, distant and cold, and yet there was something within the darkness that felt alive, sentient, observing. Those who walked beneath these heavens often felt the weight of something watching, a silent judge whose patience was endless and whose intentions were inscrutable. Kings, accustomed to commanding armies, issuing decrees, and controlling the destinies of millions, found themselves vulnerable when confronted with that which could not be tamed, measured, or reasoned with. And so, in the hushed corridors of power, in the lonely chambers where rulers pondered decisions that would affect millions, a quiet fear took root, growing silently like a shadow stretching across a sunlit floor. This fear was not simply superstition, it was a living, breathing element of courtly life. Messengers brought news of unexplained occurrences, candles extinguished without cause, the faint sound of whispers in empty rooms, fleeting glimpses of shadows that moved contrary to light. The palace guards, trained to recognize every sound, every creak, every potential threat, found themselves unnerved by things that could not be explained. Even the most rational of advisors, steeped in wisdom and careful calculation, confessed privately to a sense of unease, as if the very air carried a message they could not fully comprehend. It was in these moments that the demon revealed itself most clearly, not in acts of violence or terror, but in the subtle, persistent way it could unsettle even the most steadfast minds. Legends often begin in small, almost imperceptible ways. A fleeting shadow here, a whispered warning there, and soon the imagination begins to fill the gaps left by what is unseen. Yet, in the case of the demon-haunting kings, the whispers were often corroborated by events that seemed inexplicable, sudden deaths, inexplicable illnesses, and decisions that led to ruin despite careful planning. The correlation between fear and consequence created a feedback loop, a sense that the presence was intelligent, deliberate, and invested in the fates of those it observed. In this context, the palace became more than a center of power, It became a stage upon which the unseen played a game of subtle manipulation, each move felt but rarely understood. To fully grasp the magnitude of this haunting, one must imagine the kings themselves. Picture them seated upon thrones of gold and velvet, surrounded by advisors, generals, and scribes, yet isolated in a way that only true power can bring. Their eyes, often weary and contemplative, would wander over faces familiar and loyal, searching for signs of betrayal or weakness, yet sometimes finding only the quiet, unnerving presence of the demon itself. Sleep came fitfully, if at all, as shadows seemed to creep along walls, and the candlelight flickered in patterns that defied explanation. Even the bravest and most disciplined could not fully dismiss the sense that they were under constant scrutiny, that their every thought, every decision, every hidden desire, was observed by a force far older and wiser than any human mind. And so, as we begin this journey through time and shadow, it is essential to understand the duality of this presence. The demon was not merely a figure of terror, it was a mirror reflecting the deepest fears and insecurities of those it haunted. It magnified human vulnerability, exposing the fragility that underlies even the most formidable authority. It thrived in silence, in the spaces between sound and thought, where imagination and reality intertwined. As we move through the stories of kings, temples, rituals, and tragedies, we will witness a pattern emerge: the delicate interplay between power and fear, ambition and superstition, light and shadow. Each tale we encounter will serve not merely as history, but as a meditation on the timeless presence of forces that shape lives far beyond the comprehension of mortals. By the end of this journey, you may find that the demon is less a creature of flesh and more an embodiment of something universal, fear itself, eternal and patient, reaching across time to remind us that even the mighty are never beyond its grasp. And yet, within this darkness lies fascination, wonder, and the quiet thrill of stepping into a world where history and legend entwine. For those ready to listen, to imagine, and to surrender gently to the unfolding story, the shadows await, whispering tales that have endured for millennia, waiting to be heard once more. In the age when kings ruled with iron and gold, the world seemed larger than life yet smaller in its shadows. Palaces rose like fortresses, gleaming with marble, gold, and intricate carvings, each stone telling a story of conquest and grandeur. The throne room was a place of splendor, echoing with the measured steps of attendants, the murmur of advisors, and the distant strains of music meant to soothe or impress. Yet behind the gilded walls and carefully curated ceremonies, a more subtle power lingered: fear. This fear was not of armies alone, nor of rebellion, but of forces unseen, of whispers in the dark that no sword could strike down. Kings, even as they held dominion over vast lands and countless subjects, were acutely aware of their own fragility, the thin thread on which their fates balanced. To rule was to be exposed, constantly observed not only by courtiers and rivals but also by something beyond comprehension. Each decision bore weight far beyond the immediate. A single misstep could invite chaos or even death. Many kings, despite outward confidence, carried the unspoken knowledge that power attracted envy, betrayal, and danger, not only from human enemies but from forces that seemed to shadow every move. These were not merely metaphors, whispered in corridors or inscribed on scrolls. The ancient world treated the invisible with as much caution as the tangible. Shadows could conceal spies or assassins, yes, but they could also conceal presences that eyes could not discern, presences that would manipulate, unsettle, or torment the mind. Consider the lonely nights of these rulers. In the silence of their private chambers, away from the adoring or fearful crowds, the air felt heavier. The flicker of a lamp cast long, wavering shadows across walls adorned with trophies and emblems of past victories. Even the most disciplined monarchs would sense something amiss: a subtle movement in the corner of the eye, a whisper that seemed carried by the wind, or a chill that had no source. Sleep was elusive, for dreams themselves could become theaters of dread, amplifying the anxieties of the day. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones of kings wandering in their chambers, lost in thought or muttering prayers, attempting to soothe a fear that could not be spoken aloud. These were the moments in which the invisible force made its presence most palpable, a quiet reminder that absolute power did not equate to invulnerability. Fear, of course, was deeply personal. For some kings, it manifested as a dread of losing legacy, of seeing the achievements of their rule crumble under unseen pressures. For others, it was a fear of betrayal, of being deceived by those closest to them. And yet for many, the dread took on a supernatural shape, an entity, a demon, whose gaze pierced even the strongest walls and the deepest minds. This malevolent force became a silent counselor, an unrelenting critic, and sometimes even a cruel puppeteer of circumstance. Historians and storytellers centuries later would marvel at how this unseen presence seemed to guide decisions, spark paranoia, and twist the course of empires without ever stepping into the light. Power and fear were intertwined like twin threads of a tapestry, each enhancing the other. The grandeur of a king's court, its ornate halls, its ceremonial processions, its endless festivals, was both a display of control and a mask for vulnerability. Every parade, every triumph, was shadowed by anxiety, a constant calculation of risk and consequence. Advisors, generals, and priests were all keenly aware of this duality. Some sought to exploit it, feeding rumors or superstitions to strengthen their influence. Others, however, approached with caution, knowing that even the suggestion of supernatural presence could unravel a ruler's composure. The demon, real or imagined, occupied this delicate space between influence and myth, amplifying human fear while remaining tantalizingly intangible. Kings were not merely concerned with personal safety, the weight of their decisions extended to entire nations. A single decree could save or destroy cities, elevate allies, or condemn families to ruin. In this context, the anxiety inflicted by the unseen demon was magnified, becoming a force that shaped not only personal choices but the fate of subjects. Some rulers turned to counsel, convening the wisest priests, astrologers, and scholars to interpret omens and advise on protective measures. Others became solitary, retreating into meditation or ritual, trying to shield themselves from influences both real and imagined. Across continents and centuries, a pattern emerged. Wherever power concentrated, fear followed, and the presence of the demon was often felt most acutely in those elevated above all others. It is worth imagining the tension that filled the air during audiences or council meetings. Courtiers, generals, and foreign dignitaries would bow and speak with precision, aware that the king's mood could shift at a moment's notice. But behind every polite gesture and measured word, there was the invisible weight of the unseen, a force whose influence extended into thoughts and decisions that were otherwise private. Whispers in corridors, faint drafts that carried strange scents, flickers of torchlight that seemed almost purposeful, these were subtle signs, interpreted in myriad ways, that the demon's presence was near. Even the bravest advisors felt the chill, sensing that the ruler's anxieties were shared, magnified by something that could neither be reasoned with nor challenged openly. Across time and geography, patterns repeated. Kings of differing cultures, languages, and faiths all faced a similar phenomenon, an unseen adversary that tested their resolve, manipulated their fears, and shaped their legacies in ways that historians could only speculate upon. Some rulers responded with piety, erecting temples, commissioning prayers, or seeking divine guidance. Others responded with suppression, trying to control every aspect of their courts and lives to eliminate any chance of misfortune. Yet, no amount of ceremony or strategy seemed sufficient to remove the pervasive sense of being observed, judged, and subtly influenced. The demon, in essence, became both legend and lived experience, a constant companion to those who bore the weight of kingdoms on their shoulders. Even in moments of celebration, the shadow lingered. Banquets, festivals, and victories could not entirely dispel the feeling of being watched, for fear had already woven itself into the very fabric of royal life. Advisors and guests often whispered about strange occurrences, fleeting shadows, and odd sounds, yet these reports were rarely dismissed outright. Instead, they reinforced the invisible hierarchy of fear, a presence above all, even above the king himself, reminding everyone that power was always provisional, fragile, and subject to forces beyond comprehension. Through these subtle pressures, the demon shaped not just individual rulers but the courts themselves, influencing rituals, etiquette, and the complex web of human interactions that defined governance. By understanding the fears of kings, one begins to glimpse the unique power of this ancient demon. It thrived in isolation and authority, exploiting the vulnerabilities that come with command. It was patient, subtle, and relentless, a presence that could remain unseen yet felt in every decision, every sleepless night, every whispered worry. To study the age of kings and their fears is not merely to study history, it is to understand the human heart under the weight of power, and the ways in which unseen forces, be they divine, demonic, or psychological, can shape lives, decisions, and empires across centuries. As we move forward into the next chapters, the tales of kings haunted by the unseen will unfold with increasing clarity, drawing us deeper into the intersection of myth, history, and human vulnerability. Their grandeur, their victories, and their tragedies are all inseparable from the subtle terror that accompanied them, the quiet but relentless force that ensured no ruler, no matter how mighty, could ever truly feel secure. The origins of the demon that haunted ancient kings are as elusive as mist rolling over a silent valley at dawn. No single scroll or text can claim to capture its full essence. Instead, it emerges from a tapestry of myth, oral tradition, and sporadic historical records. Long before written chronicles, storytellers whispered of dark entities that prowled the edges of human perception, lurking just beyond firelight, just beyond the mind's ability to grasp. These early whispers described a force both subtle and overwhelming, capable of influencing events, shaping decisions, and instilling terror in those who wielded power. In many ways, it is a reminder that ancient societies, though materially advanced, remained profoundly vulnerable to the unseen. From Mesopotamia to the Nile, across the lands where empires rose and fell, traces of similar malevolent forces appear. Ancient priests spoke of entities that could enter dreams, whisper doubts, or twist the will of mortals. In the earliest Sumerian tablets, scholars have identified references to spirits that haunted rulers, manipulating kings' thoughts and sowing seeds of chaos within palaces. While these texts were cloaked in allegory and metaphor, the stories they contained spoke to a universal understanding that power alone could not shield one from the influence of forces beyond human comprehension. It is in these faint inscriptions, worn with age, that one can glimpse the beginnings of a demon whose influence would stretch across continents and centuries. The evolution of the demon's legend is fascinating because it straddles the line between history and imagination. In Egypt, the pharaoh's priests recorded rituals designed to protect the king from spirits that could disrupt divine order. These rituals, elaborate and hypnotic in nature, suggest that even those at the pinnacle of earthly authority feared entities whose existence was invisible yet palpably real. The demon, whether imagined or manifested, became an integral part of governance, as if acknowledging it was a tacit recognition that human control was always limited. In these ancient practices, we see the interplay between belief and power, the acknowledgement that a ruler's might could be tested not only by human rivals but by forces that defied earthly logic. Across the Aegean, similar stories emerge among the Mycenaeans and early Greeks. Heroes and kings faced challenges not only from mortal foes but from spirits that threatened their rule. Some accounts hint at a shadowy presence that observed and influenced kings' decisions, a spectral figure that reminded mortals that the world was far larger and far stranger than any palace or battlefield could contain. It is in these stories that the demon begins to take a form recognizable to later generations, a presence that is intelligent, persistent, and almost sentient, capable of shaping human behavior without ever revealing its true nature. This slow emergence across cultures demonstrates that the fear of the unseen is both ancient and universal, tied not only to imagination but to the human experience of power, responsibility, and mortality. Legend and history often intertwine in curious ways. One account from an ancient Babylonian tablet describes a king plagued by visions of a shadowy figure that appeared at night, whispering doubts and revealing hidden weaknesses among his advisors. The king's rule faltered, leading to political turmoil and eventual downfall. Though the language is metaphorical, historians suggest that these accounts may have been attempts to explain inexplicable events, sudden deaths, poor decision-making, or the collapse of alliances. Yet within these stories lies a consistent theme. The demon was not merely a story, it was a lens through which rulers and subjects alike could interpret the chaos of life, giving a narrative shape to fears that otherwise remained formless. The demon's presence was also marked by specific symbols and omens, which often appeared across multiple civilizations. Inscriptions, talismans, and sacred texts hint at recurring motifs: serpents coiling in the corners of rooms, shadows that moved contrary to light, and whispering voices that carried warnings or commands. These symbols became part of ritual practice, as priests and kings sought to anticipate and counteract the entity's influence. Yet even in these protective measures, the demon's legend grew stronger. By acknowledging it, societies were both attempting to control the fear and simultaneously cementing its existence in collective memory. Each incantation, each ritual, became another thread in the intricate web connecting myth and history. Stories passed down through generations add a layer of human experience to these ancient myths. The demon was often depicted not as a grotesque figure of terror but as a subtle manipulator, a presence that thrived in doubt and hesitation. It whispered when decisions were most critical, appeared when kings were most vulnerable, and exploited the delicate balance between confidence and fear. Oral tradition emphasized its cunning rather than its brute power, teaching that no amount of wealth or strength could provide immunity. Such tales were carefully crafted to instill a quiet respect for forces beyond human understanding, emphasizing that wisdom lay not only in courage but in recognizing the limits of control. In many cultures, the demon became intertwined with morality and destiny. Kings were expected to be just, wise, and observant, yet the stories suggest that even the greatest virtues could not fully protect them from influence. Some myths suggest that the demon was drawn to ambition, pride, and unchecked desire, preying upon rulers who overstepped natural limits. Others claim it acted as a test, a force challenging kings to rise above personal fears and insecurities. Through these varying interpretations, one sees the complexity of the legend. The demon was at once feared and respected, reviled and revered, a figure whose presence forced reflection upon the human condition and the responsibilities of leadership. Archaeological evidence provides glimpses that may corroborate these tales. Temples and palaces often contain inscriptions warning of unseen forces or providing prayers for protection. Some artifacts, such as intricately carved amulets or ritual objects, seem intended to ward off malevolent presences, suggesting that belief in such entities was not merely symbolic. The convergence of textual, oral, and material evidence paints a picture of a culture deeply attuned to the unseen world, one in which the demon served both as a cautionary tale and as an active participant in the lives of kings. Even today, these objects evoke awe, as if they carry the echoes of long-forgotten fears and rituals. By tracing the origins of the demon through myth, legend, and historical record, we gain insight not only into the entity itself but into the societies it touched. We see how human imagination, ritual practice, and psychological experience converge to create stories that endure across centuries. The demon was more than a specter of fear, it was a mirror reflecting human vulnerability, a shadow that revealed the insecurities hidden even behind the most powerful thrones. Its origins may be obscured by time, yet its impact is undeniable, echoing in the chronicles of kings, the architecture of palaces, and the whispered legends that survive to this day. As we move forward, the stories of kings who claim to have seen the demon will come to life with increasing vividness. Each account will illustrate the profound influence of this presence, blending historical events with the subtle, almost imperceptible power of myth. By examining these encounters, we begin to understand the ways in which fear, belief, and human imagination intertwined, creating a tapestry in which the demon could exist both in the mind and in history itself. And it is within this delicate balance that we find the enduring fascination of the legend, a story that continues to captivate, unsettle, and mesmerize across the centuries. Throughout history, certain kings claim to have seen the demon with their own eyes, and the accounts they left behind are as chilling as they are mysterious. These rulers, though powerful and often revered, spoke in hushed tones of a presence that appeared at night, slipping silently through corridors and chambers. Some described it as a shadowy figure, tall and indistinct, moving with an eerie grace that defied ordinary perception. Others claimed to hear whispers, words that seemed both familiar and alien, reminding them of failures, weaknesses, and forgotten sins. The fear that accompanied these visions was not fleeting. It lingered long after the apparition vanished, shaping their decisions, moods, and even alliances. To witness the demon was to confront one's deepest vulnerabilities, laid bare in a moment that felt suspended between reality and nightmare. Imagine a king seated upon a golden throne, the room vast and ornate, yet feeling strangely oppressive. The courtiers bow, attentive and silent, but the ruler's gaze is drawn toward the flicker of a shadow that seems to move independently of candlelight. He leans forward, heart pounding, sensing a presence that is somehow intelligent, deliberate, aware of every thought. The room is empty, yet the air vibrates with an almost imperceptible energy. The king whispers a prayer, hesitant, unsure if it will be heard or answered. In these moments, the demon manifests not as a tangible threat but as a psychological force, exploiting fear, isolation, and the immense weight of responsibility. Even kings, accustomed to commanding armies and ruling nations, were reduced to silent, trembling observers of a power they could neither see clearly nor comprehend fully. Several historical records recount these terrifying encounters in vivid detail. One ancient account describes a monarch awakening in the dead of night, convinced that a dark figure had perched on the edge of his bed. It spoke no words aloud, yet the king felt every syllable of its judgment resonate within his mind. In the following days, he made decisions guided by this unseen counsel, some wise, some catastrophic, each influenced by the lingering impression of the entity. Other rulers reported seeing fleeting shapes in mirrors, shadows that elongated unnaturally, or reflections that seemed to move contrary to their own motions. These experiences were not trivial. They affected governance, diplomacy, and even matters of war, as kings attempted to interpret signs and preempt threats they could not fully understand. Courtiers and advisors often witnessed the aftereffects of these encounters, observing changes in behavior, temperament, and priorities. A king might grow increasingly secretive, demanding absolute loyalty, or he might become erratic, issuing decrees that bewildered even the most experienced ministers. Scholars suggest that such visions could have psychological explanations: sleep paralysis, hallucinations induced by stress, or the weight of extreme responsibility, but for those who lived in the shadow of kings, the explanations mattered little. The manifestation of the demon was real in its consequences, shaping history in subtle yet profound ways. Its influence extended beyond personal fear to the lives of entire populations, affecting the outcomes of battles, the fates of cities, and the legacies of dynasties. One particularly famous account involves a king who, during a campaign, claimed to see the demon standing upon a hill overlooking his army. The figure was described as cloaked in darkness, motionless yet commanding, and its presence unnerved the troops. They reported feeling a wave of dread, a fear that seemed to seep into their bones. The king himself, though known for courage and decisiveness, hesitated, interpreting the apparition as a warning of impending disaster. This hesitation cost him a crucial battle, illustrating how the demon's influence could ripple outward, turning private fear into public consequence. Across generations, similar stories emerged. Kings halted campaigns, abandoned ambitious plans, or altered strategies in response to visions that may have been spectral, psychological, or perhaps something far stranger. What is remarkable about these encounters is their consistency across cultures and eras. From Mesopotamian rulers to Egyptian pharaohs, from Indian monarchs to European kings, descriptions of a shadowy, intelligent presence recur with eerie similarity. Often, it appeared at night, when the king was alone, emphasizing vulnerability and isolation. Its influence was subtle, rarely violent, yet profoundly persuasive. Some historians speculate that the figure was a personification of the insecurities inherent in absolute power, a way for rulers to externalize fears that could not be shared openly. Others insist that the uniformity of accounts suggests a genuine phenomenon, an intelligence beyond human understanding, moving silently through the corridors of power. Advisors and priests were often called upon to interpret these visitations. Rituals, prayers, and incantations were offered to appease or banish the entity, yet success was inconsistent at best. The king might feel momentary relief, only for the shadow to return days or weeks later, always at the edge of perception, always testing the ruler's resolve. This intermittent presence created a state of heightened awareness, a constant tension that influenced daily life. Kings learned to read subtle signs: a flicker in torchlight, a creaking door, or a sudden chill in the air. Each could signal the demon's attention, guiding behavior in ways that were almost impossible to resist. These stories were also cautionary, intended to teach future rulers about humility and vigilance. Chronicles often highlight the downfall of monarchs who ignored warnings or dismissed the unseen presence. Pride, arrogance, and overconfidence became liabilities, exploited by the demon to expose weakness and shift the balance of power. Conversely, kings who approached the entity with respect, seeking guidance and protection through rituals or wise counsel, were sometimes said to prosper. In this sense, the demon was not merely malevolent, it was a measure, a force that demanded reflection and careful stewardship. Its appearances were rare but decisive, shaping not only individual destinies but the course of entire civilizations. Even today, these accounts resonate with an almost hypnotic power. They remind us that no amount of wealth, armies, or divine claim could shield a ruler from the invisible forces that shaped their lives. The demon was an omnipresent reminder of vulnerability, a shadow that amplified insecurities and forced reflection. As we move through subsequent stories of temples, rituals, and tragedies, we will see how these visions influenced not only kings themselves but the societies they governed, leaving an indelible mark on history that continues to fascinate, unsettle, and inspire. The kings who claimed to see it were, in a sense, the keepers of its legend. Their experiences, recorded in fragments of history and myth, offer a window into the interplay of fear, power, and imagination. They illustrate the profound psychological impact of encountering something beyond comprehension, and they remind us that even those who seemed most invincible were never beyond the reach of a presence that was patient, intelligent, and relentless. By understanding their encounters, we gain insight into both the demon itself and the human heart, how power, isolation, and the unknown can intertwine to shape destiny. In the heart of ancient cities, temples rose like sanctuaries of light and mystery, places where the mortal world brushed against the divine. These were not merely buildings of stone and gold, they were carefully constructed spaces designed to channel spiritual energy, to connect kings and commoners alike to forces beyond understanding. Within their sacred halls, priests moved with deliberate grace, chanting prayers that seemed to echo through both time and space. The air was thick with incense, a haze of myrrh and frankincense curling upward like smoke carrying messages to unseen realms. Every corner, every pillar, every carved relief held significance, often representing protection, guidance, and the delicate balance between human and supernatural power. It was here, in these sanctuaries, that the presence of the demon could be addressed, negotiated, or at least acknowledged. The priests of these ancient temples were scholars of the unseen, interpreters of omens, and mediators between kings and forces beyond comprehension. They understood that the demon, though feared, was also a reflection of human vulnerability, and that its influence could be mitigated through ritual, symbolism, and devotion. Elaborate ceremonies were conducted at precise times, with the alignment of stars, the position of the sun, or the phases of the moon dictating when certain prayers or offerings were most potent. Some rituals involved sacred music, rhythmic chants, and the subtle vibration of drums and bells, designed to harmonize the spirit and create a protective aura within the palace or temple. Each action was calculated, a deliberate attempt to bring order to the chaotic influence of unseen forces. Kings themselves often participated in these rituals, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with genuine faith, understanding that even their power was incomplete without spiritual reinforcement. They donned ceremonial robes, carried sacred symbols, and followed intricate protocols, aware that any misstep could nullify the protection offered. The demon was never openly confronted, it was acknowledged subtly, a shadow on the edge of perception that demanded respect and caution. Temples, in this sense, became not only centers of worship but also fortresses against fear, spaces where human ingenuity and spiritual devotion intertwined to create a fragile sense of security. Objects played a significant role in these protective measures. Amulets, talismans, and sacred artifacts were meticulously crafted, each imbued with prayers, blessings, or inscriptions meant to ward off malevolent presences. Some objects were worn by the king, others placed strategically throughout the palace. Inscriptions might depict protective deities, symbols of strength, or warnings to the unseen forces that they were observed and resisted. Each artifact acted as a conduit between human intention and spiritual protection, a tangible expression of the struggle to assert control over the invisible. The careful placement of these objects, often guided by priests or astrologers, reflected a profound understanding of symbolism and ritual efficacy. Rituals were not static, They evolved with experience, observation, and the testimony of those who claimed to encounter the demon. If a king fell ill under mysterious circumstances, or if strange occurrences disrupted palace life, new ceremonies were devised to address the imbalance. Water was often consecrated and sprinkled, fire was ignited in protective patterns, and chants were repeated for days on end. In some cultures, music played a crucial role, with specific rhythms thought to repel or confuse spirits. Even the architecture of sacred spaces was adjusted over time to enhance spiritual protection, from the orientation of columns to the carving of runes into doorways. The integration of ritual, space, and material culture exemplified the lengths to which ancient civilizations went to shield themselves from forces they could neither see nor fully comprehend. Priests were not merely executors of ritual, they were also advisors, scholars, and interpreters. They studied celestial movements, examined sacred texts, and advised kings on appropriate offerings or behavioral conduct to maintain divine favor. Their influence was immense because the demon was not seen as a predictable enemy but as a subtle force, one that could strike at moments of weakness or indecision. Kings relied on priests to guide their actions, to anticipate signs of supernatural unrest, and to maintain a delicate equilibrium between human authority and spiritual vigilance. In this collaboration, the lines between religion, politics, and the supernatural blurred, creating a holistic system in which belief, fear, and power reinforced each other. The effectiveness of these rituals often depended as much on psychological reassurance as on spiritual intervention. A king who believed he was protected by sacred ceremonies was more confident, more decisive, and less susceptible to the paralyzing fear the demon could instill. In contrast, neglecting ritual or doubting its efficacy could leave a ruler vulnerable to the subtle influences of uncertainty, indecision, and dread. This dynamic underscores the profound interplay between mind, belief, and environment. The demon's influence was not solely external, but intertwined with human perception, amplifying weaknesses that were already present. The careful choreography of temple rituals, therefore, served both practical and psychological purposes, reinforcing human resilience in the face of unseen menace. Stories of miraculous protection abound. Kings who followed the counsel of priests meticulously reported feeling a sense of calm during moments of crisis, attributing victories in battle, resolution of political tension, or even personal health to the protective rituals performed in temples. Conversely, those who ignored or questioned these ceremonies often faced inexplicable misfortune, which chroniclers would later interpret as punishment or warning from the unseen entity. These narratives, while difficult to verify historically, provide a vivid glimpse into the symbiotic relationship between ritual, belief, and the perceived presence of supernatural influence. They also highlight the ingenuity and resourcefulness of ancient societies in confronting fear with structure, symbolism, and devotion. In every ancient kingdom, stories whispered of rulers and nobles who were not merely haunted but broken by the shadow's touch. These were not ordinary tales of defeat or misfortune, but sagas of descent into madness, where once mighty kings lost their grip on reason and where entire dynasties trembled under the weight of invisible torment. Tragedy followed like a patient predator, waiting for the precise moment when the demon's influence would tip the fragile balance of the human mind. It was in these accounts that the true power of the entity revealed itself, not by destroying bodies, but by unraveling minds, slowly, deliberately, until even the strongest were left trembling before their own thoughts. One such tale speaks of a monarch who reigned over a prosperous land. His kingdom flourished with trade, his people adored him, and his armies were undefeated. Yet late at night, he confessed to hearing whispers echoing through the palace halls. At first, he dismissed them as dreams, figments of a weary mind. But soon the whispers grew persistent, forming words, phrases, and accusations. They told him that his advisors were conspiring, that his queen plotted betrayal, that his own sons coveted his throne. Though no evidence supported these suspicions, the king began to act on them. He dismissed trusted counselors, imprisoned loyal generals, and banished his children. In the end, he ruled alone, a hollow figure surrounded only by silence and fear. His reign ended not with invasion, but with despair, as the demon's whispers turned his once bright world into an echoing chamber of paranoia. Madness was often the most devastating gift the demon could bestow. Unlike physical enemies, which could be fought with swords or defended against with walls, this force attacked from within. Kings who once strode confidently through their palaces began to avoid mirrors, convinced they saw shapes lurking just beyond their reflections. They muttered to themselves in council meetings, startled by invisible movements in empty chambers. Servants reported strange behaviors, a ruler staring for hours into darkness, laughing suddenly at nothing, or refusing to sleep for fear of what might come in dreams. These signs of unraveling disturbed not only the palace but the kingdom at large. The people, attuned to the moods of their sovereign, began to fear that divine favor had been withdrawn, that the entire realm stood under a shadow from which no ritual could protect them. Some tragedies took the form of sudden collapse. A well-documented account describes a ruler preparing for a great festival, walking proudly before his people, when he suddenly froze mid-step, eyes wide with terror. He claimed to see a figure amidst the crowd, a dark presence standing motionless, staring only at him. The king screamed, dropping his ceremonial scepter, and fled the procession. For weeks afterward, he refused to leave his chambers, insisting that the demon lingered at his door. Ministers attempted to reassure him, priests conducted endless rituals, but his fear remained unshaken. Within months, the once vibrant leader grew emaciated, consumed by sleepless nights and visions of torment. His death was recorded as natural, but those who had witnessed his decline knew otherwise. It was the shadow that had unmade him. Not all victims were kings. Nobles, generals, and even ordinary citizens occasionally reported encounters that led to ruin. A noblewoman, celebrated for her wisdom and beauty, claimed to hear the voice of the demon in her dreams. It whispered promises of power and secrets hidden from mortal eyes. For a time, she followed its guidance, rising in influence at court and weaving a web of alliances. Yet the voice soon turned cruel, mocking her, accusing her of treachery, reminding her of every slight and failure. Her brilliance faded into obsession, her laughter turned brittle, and her influence crumbled. In the end, she wandered the palace gardens aimlessly, speaking to shadows that no one else could see. Her tragedy became a warning to all who believed they could listen to the demon and remain unscathed. Tragedy was not always confined to individuals, it could engulf entire kingdoms. There are stories of rulers whose madness led to catastrophic decisions, declaring war without reason, destroying alliances, or executing innocents under imagined accusations. These choices, born of fear and paranoia, destabilized nations, leaving them vulnerable to external threats or internal rebellion. The demon did not need to lift a hand. By sowing fear in the heart of one man, it could unravel the fates of thousands. Civilizations that might have thrived for centuries crumbled because one ruler's mind became a battlefield for unseen forces. History's pages are stained not only with blood spilled in open combat but also with the quiet tragedies of leaders who fell prey to a war waged within their own thoughts. Some tales suggest that madness itself was a kind of possession, that the demon did not merely whisper but inhabited its victims, steering their words and actions like a hidden puppeteer. Witnesses described sudden changes in personality, gentle rulers becoming cruel, courageous generals struck with cowardice, or just leaders descending into tyranny overnight. Such transformations were terrifying because they seemed inexplicable. Priests and healers attempted every method of cleansing, rituals of fire, baths of consecrated water, endless chanting, but their success was rare. More often, the afflicted wasted away, consumed from within, leaving behind only cautionary stories to remind future generations of the dangers of unguarded minds. Yet within these tales of madness, there is always a thread of tragedy that transcends fear. The kings and nobles who succumbed were not villains in their own time but often figures of admiration and hope. Their downfall was not a punishment for arrogance alone but a reminder of the fragility of the human mind. Power and wisdom, wealth and armies, offered no shield against the inner unraveling brought by the demon's influence. Each story is tinged with sorrow, as if the chroniclers themselves grieved for what was lost, not only a ruler but the potential of an entire kingdom. Madness was both personal and collective, a shadow that spread outward, dimming the light of whole societies. Even in modern reflection, these stories hold weight. They speak to the timeless fear of losing one's grip on reality, of being betrayed not by enemies but by one's own mind. They remind us of the delicate balance between strength and vulnerability, between power and paranoia. Whether the demon was an actual presence or a manifestation of psychological strain, the tragedies it inspired were real enough to alter the course of history. They endure not simply as ghost stories but as profound lessons about the cost of ignoring the shadows that dwell within. As we drift deeper into these narratives, the line between myth and memory blurs. Were these rulers haunted by an external entity, or were they victims of human frailty magnified by unimaginable pressure? The answer remains hidden in the silence of history, but the impact is undeniable. Madness and tragedy, woven into the fabric of these ancient stories, reveal the most chilling truth of all, that the demon's greatest weapon was not terror or destruction, but the subtle, patient unraveling of the mind. If the walls of palaces carried whispers of the demon, then the pages of ancient literature gave those whispers form, voice, and permanence. Across civilizations, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, from India to Greece, epic tales and sacred writings wove its presence into myths, legends, and cautionary stories. These were not casual mentions. The demon appeared as a recurring archetype, a shadow hidden within humanity's most enduring narratives. To read these texts today is to glimpse the mindset of ancient peoples, who understood that the invisible could shape destiny just as profoundly as visible armies or natural disasters. One of the earliest references comes from Mesopotamian literature, where clay tablets etched with cuneiform inscriptions describe encounters with malevolent forces that stalked kings and heroes alike. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, though the demon itself is never named directly, there are passages that speak of dark presences haunting the edges of human ambition. Gilgamesh, restless and proud, is warned of entities that wait in the night, feeding on despair and arrogance. The warning is subtle, almost poetic, yet powerful. Those who rise too high must watch for the shadows that follow. Scholars believe such passages were deliberate, reminders to rulers that no matter their greatness, there existed forces eager to humble them. Egyptian literature also contains whispers of the shadow. In the Book of the Dead, a sacred text guiding souls through the afterlife, there are references to malevolent beings who stand at the gates of passage, questioning and tormenting the unworthy. Some of these descriptions echo the same imagery attributed to the demon: tall, indistinct, cloaked in darkness, speaking words that pierce the soul. Egyptian scribes recorded spells and prayers specifically crafted to counter such beings, emphasizing that knowledge, devotion, and moral strength could repel what weapons could not. The demon, therefore, was woven into the very framework of the afterlife journey, a test of resilience as much as a trial of worthiness. In Indian epics, such as the Mahabharata and Ramayana, we encounter figures that resemble the demon not in form but in function. Characters are often tempted, tested, or tormented by forces that exploit their weaknesses. A king might be drawn into obsession, a warrior into doubt, or a sage into despair. Though many of these forces are given names, Rakshasas, Asuras, or malevolent spirits, the underlying theme remains the same: unseen entities that thrive on human vulnerability. The demon's archetype appears as a reminder that strength is not only measured in battle but in the endurance of the mind and heart against subtle, corrosive influences. Greek literature offers its own echoes. In tragedies penned by playwrights such as Aeschylus and Euripides, rulers are often undone not by swords but by inner torment. A shadow appears in dreams, a whisper turns certainty into doubt, and paranoia corrodes judgment until disaster strikes. While the Greeks personified such forces as gods or furies, the resemblance to the demon is unmistakable. In Homer's epics, particularly the Iliad, moments of hesitation, rage, or despair are sometimes attributed to divine manipulation. A warrior stands ready for glory, yet a sudden fear grips him. A general commands decisively, then falters at a crucial moment. Behind these changes, ancient audiences recognized the hand of unseen forces, whether gods or shadows. The demon, as concept, found fertile ground in the Greek imagination, embodying the eternal struggle between mortal ambition and invisible restraint. Literature also preserved the voices of those who lived in the shadow's presence. In fragmented hymns, chants, and prayers, kings and commoners alike begged for relief from what they described as the weight of darkness. One Babylonian tablet, partially broken yet still haunting, records a prayer: "Let the shadow pass from me, let the whisper be silenced, let my mind be as still waters. Such words are simple yet profound, capturing the intimate fear that the demon's presence inspired. These fragments are not just historical curiosities, they are raw expressions of human vulnerability, testaments to the timeless desire for peace of mind. Stories of tragedy found their way into cautionary epics, serving as lessons for generations. One Mesopotamian tale describes a king who refused ritual protection, mocking the idea of unseen powers. He declared that steel and stone were his gods, that no shadow could harm him. Yet as the story unfolds, his kingdom suffers famine, rebellion, and plague. The moral is unmistakable: arrogance blinds the ruler, and in that blindness, the demon finds its opening. Another tale, this one from Persian tradition, tells of a hero who journeys into the desert seeking wisdom. There he encounters a figure cloaked in shadow, who offers him truths too heavy to bear. The hero returns wiser but broken, unable to speak of what he learned. His silence, heavy and tragic, is interpreted by later poets as evidence of an encounter with the same force kings had always feared. What makes these literary appearances remarkable is their consistency across cultures separated by distance and time. Whether in clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, or oral traditions passed down through generations, the demon appears again and again, not as a single named entity but as an archetype, a pattern. Its form is mutable, but its essence is constant, a force that exploits human frailty, tests rulers, and reshapes destinies. This repetition suggests that the demon was not merely a product of one culture's imagination but a universal symbol of fear, doubt, and the invisible weight carried by those in positions of power. In epic poetry, the demon also served a narrative function. Heroes needed adversaries that were not merely physical but spiritual, challenges that tested not their weapons but their resolve. To face a shadow that whispered doubts was to confront the most intimate enemy of all, oneself. The demon, in literature, becomes a mirror, reflecting not only human flaws but the consequences of ignoring them. Kings who listened too closely were destroyed, those who denied its existence were blinded, but those who acknowledged and resisted it found strength. In this way, the demon was not only a villain but also a teacher, embodying the paradox of danger and wisdom intertwined. For audiences of these ancient works, the stories carried a dual effect. On one hand, they inspired fear, reinforcing the need for ritual, faith, and vigilance. On the other, they provided comfort by framing unseen dread within narrative structure. A story, after all, gives meaning to chaos. To hear that even great kings wrestled with shadows was to feel less alone, to understand that fear was a universal burden. The literature did not banish the demon, but it gave people a way to speak of it, to wrap words around what could not be named directly. Even today, when we read these ancient epics, we feel the lingering presence of that archetype. The demon's shadow stretches across millennia, reminding us that humanity has always sought to name the nameless, to tell stories of the unseen, and to find meaning in fear. Literature preserved its image not only as a threat but as a constant companion to human ambition. Every story of tragedy, every whispered prayer, every shadow cast across a hero's path was part of a larger tapestry, one that tells us, wherever power and pride exist, so too does the shadow waiting nearby. Through epic tales and sacred writings, the demon's legend became immortal. Though kings and kingdoms fell, though temples crumbled and languages faded, the stories endured. They remind us that long before psychology and science sought to explain fear, ancient peoples already knew its shape, already understood its persistence. The demon was their way of speaking about the unseen, their metaphor for the weight of vulnerability carried by every human soul. And in that understanding, they gave us not only stories of darkness but timeless lessons about courage, humility, and the fragile balance between strength and despair. Across ancient civilizations, the struggle against unseen forces gave rise to a strange and fascinating tradition, the creation of ritual objects and the reverence, or fear, of cursed relics. These items, whether carved from stone, forged in metal, or inscribed with sacred words, were believed to hold power over the demon that haunted kings. They were not mere symbols of faith but living conduits of protection, channels through which humanity attempted to negotiate with the invisible. Some were treasured as shields of light, while others, darkened by misfortune and legend, were shunned as vessels of the demon itself. Temples often became the repositories of such sacred tools. Priests guarded amulets said to radiate protective energy, talismans inscribed with secret prayers, and figurines carved to embody divine guardianship. Kings wore amulets around their necks or concealed them in the folds of ceremonial robes, convinced that these small objects could repel whispers and shadows. One famous artifact, recorded in Babylonian tradition, was a bronze seal engraved with symbols of the god Marduk. It was believed that whoever carried the seal would remain untouched by the demon's influence. For decades, kings swore by its power, until one monarch, its keeper, fell into madness. The people whispered that the seal itself had become corrupted, its blessing inverted into a curse. This dual nature, objects that protected yet could themselves become dangerous, was a theme repeated throughout cultures. In Egypt, funerary amulets shaped like scarabs or eyes were buried with rulers to ensure safe passage into the afterlife. But occasionally, a scarab carved imperfectly or inscribed incorrectly was said to open the way for darker forces. In one tale, a prince was buried with such a flawed relic, and soon after, his tomb became a site of hauntings. Workers spoke of shadows that moved across the walls and voices that mocked them in the night. The relic, once a token of protection, had become a cursed object, a reminder of the razor-thin line between safety and danger when dealing with unseen powers. Ritual objects were not only worn or buried, they were also placed strategically throughout palaces and temples. Doorways bore carved symbols to block the demon's entry, thresholds were lined with protective stones, and thrones themselves were inscribed with prayers to guard rulers from whispers of doubt. The throne of an Assyrian king was famously said to be guarded by two carved lions, each inscribed with sacred words on their claws. As long as the king sat between them, the demon could not approach. Yet after his sudden fall into paranoia, the lions were broken apart, hidden in fear that they had absorbed the very presence they were meant to repel. But not every relic was born from devotion. Some were born of tragedy, their histories soaked in blood and despair. These became cursed relics, feared as much as the demon itself. A sword once wielded by a king who descended into madness was said to carry the shadow of his torment. Whoever touched it felt a surge of dread, as though the whispers of the fallen king still clung to the blade. Chronicles tell of generals who refused to wield it, despite its craftsmanship, for they feared inheriting the same fate. Such cursed relics were often locked away, sealed in stone chambers, or even buried beneath rivers in hopes that the current would wash their influence away. One of the most chilling stories concerns a crown, gleaming with gold, jewels, and inscriptions, crafted for a young ruler in Mesopotamia. Upon wearing it, he was said to hear whispers more clearly than ever before. At first, the crown seemed to grant wisdom. He issued brilliant decrees, strengthened alliances, and guided his people with clarity. But over time, the voice within grew domineering, steering him into cruelty and paranoia. He executed friends, exiled priests, and plunged his kingdom into ruin. After his death, the crown was sealed in a temple vault, never to be worn again. Priests claimed it was no longer merely a crown but a cursed relic, a vessel through which the demon could speak directly into the minds of kings. The idea of cursed relics reveals much about how ancient people understood the balance of power. To them, objects could absorb the essence of events, the blood spilled upon them, the prayers whispered into them, or the tragedies they witnessed. In this sense, a relic was not inert, it was alive, carrying memories, energies, and intentions. When those intentions soured, the object became dangerous, radiating despair or corruption like a lingering shadow. It was not uncommon for priests to conduct elaborate rituals to cleanse or destroy such relics, though with mixed success. Some items resisted purification, their histories too deeply stained. These were locked away, hidden in labyrinths or buried in deserts, accompanied by warnings inscribed on stone, "Disturb not, lest the shadow return." Yet despite the dangers, kings could not abandon ritual objects. The fear of the demon was too pervasive, and the hope of protection too essential. Each ruler believed he might succeed where others had failed, that his relic would remain pure, his amulet unbroken, his crown untainted. It was a gamble of faith and desperation, a wager against the unseen. And so the cycle continued. Objects crafted, blessed, revered, then feared, cursed, and hidden. Their stories became part of the collective memory, cautionary tales passed down through generations, reminding all who heard them of the fragile boundary between light and shadow. Even today, some of these objects survive, displayed in museums or hidden in private collections. Scholars study the intricate carvings, the worn edges of amulets once clasped in trembling hands, the faded inscriptions meant to hold back darkness. To us, they are artifacts of artistry and history. To the ancients, they were lifelines in a world where shadows had voices. Whether they truly carried the weight of unseen forces or whether their power resided in belief itself, one thing is clear: ritual objects and cursed relics shaped the way civilizations confronted fear. They gave form to the invisible, embodied human hopes and anxieties, and stood as both shield and snare in the endless dance with the demon that haunted ancient kings. Throughout history, wars have been fought for land, for power, and for faith. Disasters have struck with little warning, reshaping kingdoms and humbling kings. Yet in the ancient imagination, these calamities were rarely explained as mere chance or natural misfortune. To them, behind every battlefield loss, behind every storm that destroyed harvests, behind every sudden collapse of empires, there lurked an invisible hand, the demon that haunted rulers, whispering madness into their ears and unleashing chaos upon their realms. The chronicles of Mesopotamia speak often of this connection. A battle lost was never only about military failure. It was a sign, they believed, that the king's spirit had been compromised, that the demon had clouded his judgment or weakened his courage. When armies faltered, priests searched not for strategic errors but for spiritual corruption. A ruler under the demon's influence might delay an attack, misread omens, or issue commands that doomed his soldiers. Afterward, survivors would murmur, the king had been whispered to, and the whispers had led them into ruin. One of the earliest such accounts comes from the reign of King Enlil. His chronicles describe how his armies, once disciplined and strong, suddenly turned against themselves in battle. Confusion spread through the ranks, soldiers mistook allies for enemies, striking one another in panic. Enlil himself retreated into silence, refusing to give orders as his men fell in droves. The battle ended in massacre, and the survivors swore they had heard voices calling their names in the chaos, voices that lured them into attacking brothers and friends. Priests concluded that the demon had not only invaded the king's mind but also stretched its influence outward, sowing discord across the battlefield itself. It was not only battles but entire wars that bore the mark of this unseen force. In Assyrian legend, a great campaign against a rival city was said to have begun with noble purpose. The king claimed he was divinely inspired, that he would bring order and justice. Yet as the campaign wore on, his orders grew cruel. He burned villages unnecessarily, slaughtered innocents, and ignored the pleas of his advisors. His victories turned to ashes as alliances crumbled, allies betrayed him, and famine struck his camp. Eventually, his own generals rose against him. Later scribes wrote that his fall was not the work of men but of the demon, which had driven him into madness so complete that he destroyed the very foundations of his own rule. Natural disasters, too, were explained through this dark lens. Floods that swept through fertile lands, earthquakes that split cities, plagues that thinned populations, these were not only the wrath of gods but the triumphs of the demon who haunted kings. In Egypt, when the Nile failed to flood, causing famine, whispers spread that Pharaoh had allowed himself to be corrupted. As above, so below, the priests would say, if the king's mind was in disorder, the land itself would fall into chaos. Thus the demon's influence was believed to ripple outward from one man's soul into the very fabric of nature. There is a chilling tale from the Hittite Empire. During the reign of Mesopotamian II, a plague struck the land, killing thousands. The king wrote prayers in which he confessed that his father's sins might have invited the disaster. Yet among the people, the story grew darker. The plague was the demon's vengeance, a curse unleashed because the king had failed to resist its whispering. Even when Mesopotamian himself pleaded with the gods for forgiveness, the sickness raged on. 4 generations after, the memory of that plague was tied not only to divine anger but to the demon's unseen victory. One of the most haunting narratives comes from the fall of Babylon to the Persians. Though history records Cyrus the Great's clever strategy in diverting the Euphrates River to breach the city walls, Babylonian storytellers remembered it differently. They claimed their last king, Nabonidus, had been consumed by strange visions long before the Persians arrived. He neglected his duties, withdrew into temples, and left the city vulnerable. When the Persians marched in, barely a fight was given. To the people, this collapse was not the result of military genius but of their king's surrender to whispers that drained his will. The demon had hollowed him out, leaving Babylon defenseless. Across cultures, the demon became the unseen explanation for why great men fell and empires crumbled. To the Greeks, when leaders ignored wise counsel and pursued reckless wars, poets suggested it was because a dark spirit had clouded their minds. In India, texts spoke of kings who, upon straying from righteousness, invited disaster not only upon themselves but upon their lands. In China, the mandate of heaven was believed to be withdrawn from rulers who descended into cruelty or madness. Though the terms differed, the essence was the same: a corrupting force had entered the king's soul, and in his downfall all his people suffered. The theme of wars and disasters being linked to spiritual corruption gave ancient people both fear and explanation. It allowed them to see patterns where chaos reigned. If a storm destroyed the harvest, it was not random, it was proof their ruler had been compromised. If an army was routed, it was not simply poor tactics but evidence of whispering shadows guiding decisions. This way of thinking bound political, natural, and spiritual realms together in one grand narrative of struggle between light and darkness. And within this worldview, every calamity reinforced the terror of the demon's presence. For how could one resist a force that did not merely speak to individuals but seemed to bend the course of entire nations? Wars, they believed, were not only fought with swords and shields but also with prayers and rituals. Disasters were not only endured but interpreted, woven into the ongoing story of humanity's fragile stand against unseen enemies. It is striking that even when victories came, they were framed as temporary triumphs over darkness. A king who won a great battle might attribute it to his faith, his purity, his ability to resist whispers. But the celebration was always edged with caution. For the demon was patient. If not today, then tomorrow. If not this king, then his son. So long as there were thrones, there would be shadows waiting beside them. Thus, wars and disasters became not merely episodes of history but chapters in an epic struggle. They reminded people of their vulnerability, their dependence on rulers' clarity of mind, and the thin line separating prosperity from ruin. Every flood, every battle lost, every plague carried with it not just suffering but meaning, evidence of a deeper, invisible war that stretched across centuries, with kings as its chosen battleground. In the stillness of the night, as people huddled by fires and whispered to one another about the tragedies they had witnessed, they did not speak only of famine or fire. They spoke of shadows moving through palaces, of whispers echoing in the ears of kings, of a presence that grew stronger each time disaster struck. For them, every war, every catastrophe, was not only a story of men and nature but a reminder of the demon's eternal, patient hunt. In the ancient world, where the boundaries between the seen and unseen blurred with every flicker of lamplight, few ceremonies carried more weight than exorcisms and royal purification rituals. They were not merely religious performances, they were lifelines, desperate attempts to protect the ruler, the heart of the kingdom, from the whispering presence of the demon. For as the people believed, if the king fell, the land itself would wither, and if the demon's shadow clung too long, all order would collapse into ruin. Thus, exorcisms became weapons as vital as swords, and purification rituals, shields as strong as armies. When a king began to show signs of unease, muttering to unseen companions, staring into darkness as though listening, trembling during ceremonies, his attendants acted swiftly. Priests were summoned, their arrival marked by the ringing of bells and the burning of incense. The palace itself would be transformed into a sacred chamber, doorways sealed, floors sprinkled with purifying waters, and torches lit to banish shadows. The air would thicken with the scent of resins and herbs, chosen for their power to repel corruption. Silence would fall, save for the rhythmic chants of priests who stepped slowly, circling the afflicted king as though weaving a net of sound around him. Central to these exorcisms were words, incantations that carried the weight of centuries. In Mesopotamia, the priest known as the Ipu specialized in driving out evil forces. He would recite prayers to the gods, invoking them as guardians and demanding that the intruder depart. Each syllable was measured, each pause deliberate, for they believed the demon listened closely and could be confused, bound, or banished through the right combination of sacred speech. The king, often trembling or weeping, would kneel upon reed mats as the priest sprinkled him with water drawn from holy rivers, believed to carry the life-giving purity of creation itself. Objects, too, played their part in the ritual. Amulets carved with divine symbols were placed upon the king's chest. Small figurines of protective deities were arranged around him, facing outward, as if to shield him from all directions. In some ceremonies, the priests would hold torches close, believing that fire, ever hungry, ever purifying, would drive the shadow from its hiding place. If the king cried out, they would not stop. His cries were taken as proof that the hidden presence was resisting, lashing out as it was forced into retreat. Perhaps the most dramatic of these rituals was the substitution ceremony. When priests feared that the demon had marked a king for death, they sought to trick it. A substitute king, a humble servant, or sometimes even a condemned prisoner, would be dressed in royal robes and placed upon the throne. For a set period, this false king bore the weight of the curse. He was paraded, fed, and treated with honor, while the true king was hidden away, purified in secret. Then, at the appointed time, the substitute was removed, his role completed, his fate sealed. Some were executed, others cast out, but always with the belief that the demon had been deceived into seizing the wrong soul. This grim practice revealed the depth of fear that rulers felt, willing to sacrifice another life to preserve their own and, by extension, their kingdom. Egyptian purification rituals took on a different rhythm, blending beauty with solemnity. Pharaohs, considered divine, could not be publicly seen as vulnerable to corruption. Yet even they submitted to quiet cleansing. In candlelit chambers, priests of Sekhmet or Thoth would bathe the ruler in sacred oils, anointing his skin with fragrant balm said to close the gates through which whispers entered. Hieroglyphs of protection were painted temporarily on his arms and chest, glowing faintly in the firelight. The king's breath was purified with incense, his ears touched with charms to block unseen voices. It was not only his body but his senses, sight, hearing, speech, that were ritually cleansed, as if every pathway into the soul had to be guarded. The Hittites, facing devastating plagues, performed communal exorcisms with their rulers at the center. Entire cities would join in the ritual, fires lit on rooftops, drums beaten in unison, people chanting prayers that rolled like thunder through the night. The king stood among them, dressed in plain garments, his crown removed. By humbling himself before his people and the gods, he sought to shed whatever pride or corruption had opened him to the demon's influence. At dawn, when the fires burned low, sacrifices of animals were made, their blood poured upon the earth as a symbolic cleansing. To the people, this act restored balance, transferring the stain of corruption into the offering and sealing it away with the rising sun. Despite their grandeur, these ceremonies were not always successful. Some kings emerged from exorcisms seemingly renewed, their paranoia lifted, their strength restored. Others fell deeper into shadow, their eyes hollow, their minds fraying further. In such cases, the failure was often blamed on timing. The ritual had been performed too late, the whispers too deeply rooted. Or it was said the demon had grown stronger than the priests, resisting their chants, mocking their efforts. These failures only deepened the fear, convincing people that the enemy they faced was cunning, adaptable, and eternal. But even in failure, the rituals served a purpose. They reassured the people that their leaders were not passive in the face of darkness. They wove hope into the hearts of citizens who feared the spread of calamity. And they reinforced the belief that kingship was not merely political but profoundly spiritual, that a ruler was as much a guardian of cosmic order as he was of earthly territory. Exorcisms and purification rituals also revealed an essential truth about ancient power: kings were not invincible. For all their armies, wealth, and divine titles, they could still be vulnerable to a whisper, a shadow, a fleeting thought planted in the silence of night. The need for purification laid bare their humanity, reminding all who witnessed the ceremonies that even the greatest of men stood at the edge of unseen abysses. Across cultures, the rituals varied, but the purpose remained the same: to cleanse, to shield, to restore. to remind the demon that though it stalked endlessly, humanity would not surrender without a fight. Fire, water, prayer, sacrifice. These were the weapons the ancients wielded against an enemy they could not see, an enemy that haunted thrones and stalked crowns. And so, in the candlelit chambers of Mesopotamia, in the incense-thick temples of Egypt, in the firelit plazas of the Hittites, kings knelt trembling as priests fought unseen battles around them. The rituals may have ended with silence, with the extinguishing of lamps, with the dispersal of smoke into the night, but in the minds of those present, a fragile victory had been won. For one more day, the demon had been held at bay. Long before written chronicles recorded the whispers that haunted rulers, the tales of the demon had already seeped into myths and epics. These were not merely stories for entertainment, they were vessels carrying truths, warnings, and echoes of fear through generations. In the silence of the night, as fires flickered low and the air thickened with the weight of stories, these myths shaped how entire civilizations understood the unseen adversary. The demon was not just a shadow in history, it became a character in humanity's greatest legends, a presence woven into the fabric of epic poetry and oral traditions. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest surviving works of literature, carries faint whispers of such a being. Though the epic itself speaks of gods, monsters, and immortality, some scholars suggest that within its darker passages lie reflections of the demon that haunted kings. Gilgamesh's restless quest, his paranoia, his confrontations with shadows that cannot be slain, echo the fears of rulers who believed themselves pursued by an invisible tormentor. When Gilgamesh returns from his futile search for eternal life, broken and weary, his despair is not unlike that of a king drained by whispers, one who has glimpsed his own vulnerability. Though the demon is never named, its shadow may be hidden between the lines, a silent antagonist haunting even heroes. Other myths speak more directly. The Babylonians told of Pazuzu, a terrifying spirit with the body of a man, the claws of a lion, and the wings of a bird. Though often invoked as a protector against other demons, Pazuzu embodied both fear and fascination. He was unpredictable, capable of warding off illness yet also spreading it. For kings, Pazuzu represented the duality of unseen forces, sometimes shield, sometimes curse, never fully tamed. His image adorned amulets placed in royal chambers, a grim reminder that protection often came from mastering terror itself. Was Pazuzu the demon that haunted kings, or merely one of its many masks? The answer was left deliberately ambiguous, as if the ancients themselves could not decide whether they faced one shadow or many. In Egyptian myth, the figure of Apophis, also known as Apep, embodied chaos. This colossal serpent sought each night to devour the sun god Ra as he traveled through the underworld. Though not tied to kingship directly, Apophis represented the eternal struggle against darkness that resonated with pharaohs. Every day, rituals were performed to aid Ra's victory, and every night, Egyptians feared that Apophis might succeed. For rulers, Apophis became a metaphor for their own battle. Just as Ra must resist the serpent's endless attacks, kings must resist the whispering demon that sought to devour their minds. The parallel was powerful. Pharaohs cast themselves as reflections of Ra, guardians of order against chaos. And yet, in private chambers, they knew the serpent could appear within, in the form of doubt and madness. Among the Greeks, myths often spoke of daimons, spirits neither wholly divine nor entirely mortal. Some were benevolent, guiding men toward wisdom. Others were malevolent, feeding on human weakness. In the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles, kings and heroes alike were undone by forces beyond their control. Agamemnon, who returned victorious from Troy only to be murdered in his own hall, was said to be cursed by the wrath of spirits. Oedipus, whose downfall was foretold, became a symbol of how destiny, whispers, and unseen powers conspired to unseat even the greatest. Though the Greeks gave their forces names and faces, Nemesis, the Furies, the Moirai, the underlying theme mirrored the older belief that rulers were never safe from hidden forces. The demon of Mesopotamia had found new voices in Greek myth, reshaped into characters of fate and vengeance. In the Sanskrit epics of India, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, demons, known as Rakshasas and Asuras, play central roles. Ravana, the many-headed king of Lanka, is both a mighty ruler and a demon, consumed by desire and arrogance. His whispers lead to the abduction of Sita, triggering a war that reshapes kingdoms. In the Mahabharata, the blind king Dhritarashtra, though human, is often portrayed as a man ruled by weakness, unable to resist the manipulations of darker forces. His failure to control his sons brings about the Great War of Kurukshetra. These epics do not simply tell tales of gods and demons, they mirror the same fears found in Mesopotamian records, that rulers, once corrupted or blinded, would drag entire nations into catastrophe. Chinese legends, too, preserve this theme. The stories of ghostly advisors, of emperors driven mad by unseen voices, of dynasties collapsing after rulers lost the mandate of heaven, all carried echoes of the same archetype. The demon here was not always named, yet its presence was implied. A ruler who grew cruel, paranoid, or indulgent was believed to have invited dark spirits into his court. The fall of the Shang dynasty, for instance, was attributed to King Ju's descent into tyranny, spurred by his obsession with a woman said to be possessed by a fox spirit. In such tales, the demon was both personal and political, striking at the throne through desire, weakness, or pride. What these myths and epics reveal is not merely a fear of external monsters but of inner corruption. The demon was often cloaked in narrative, sometimes a dragon, sometimes a serpent, sometimes a whispering spirit, but its essence remained constant. It was the force that twisted strength into arrogance, turned wisdom into paranoia, and transformed kings into tyrants. By placing the demon within epic tales, cultures preserved a truth that history alone could not bear to state outright, that every king, no matter how mighty, stood on fragile ground, forever shadowed by forces he could neither see nor fully resist. These myths also served a practical role. They warned rulers of the dangers of pride, hubris, and neglect. By dressing these warnings in the garments of legend, storytellers ensured their lessons endured. A king might dismiss the criticisms of his advisors, but he could not so easily dismiss the story of a hero undone by whispers or a god ensnared by shadow. Myths, then, were not only entertainment, they were tools of survival, guiding rulers through allegory, reminding them that vigilance was the only shield against ruin. In the soft tones of epic recitation, often performed at night, entire communities absorbed these lessons together. As the bard's voice rose and fell, listeners could almost feel the presence of the unseen antagonist lurking behind the words. The demon was never far, it slipped between verses, lingered in pauses, waited in silences. Children learned to fear it early. Adults carried its shadow into their understanding of power. Kings, listening in their halls, heard in these tales a mirror of their own anxieties. The myth was no longer just a story, it was a reflection of reality. And so, across continents and centuries, the demon took on many names, many faces, many roles. It became a serpent swallowing the sun, a cursed crown that whispered commands, a demon of fate, a Rakshasa king, a fox spirit queen. Yet beneath all these guises, the essence remained unchanged. The demon haunted not only rulers but the very idea of rulership itself. Wherever power gathered, shadows followed. Wherever crowns gleamed, whispers lingered. And in myths and epics, humanity gave shape to this truth, ensuring that even as rulers came and went, the story of the demon endured. Even today, when we read these myths or hear their retellings, we can sense the deeper current beneath them. They are not only about gods and monsters, heroes and villains. They are about the fragility of human will, the burden of leadership, and the ever-present danger of corruption. The demon in myths is, at its heart, a reminder that no man, however mighty, can escape the shadows that walk beside power. The twilight of an empire is never an event contained within the boundaries of one generation, it is a long, slow unraveling, like a great tapestry fraying thread by thread. In the ancient world, where kings were often measured not only by their military victories but also by their ability to protect their people from forces both visible and unseen, the arrival of calamity was never interpreted as mere chance. Pestilence, famine, and foreign invasions were all woven into a spiritual framework. The gods, it was said, had turned their faces away, or worse, they had allowed the demons to walk unchecked among mortals. For the rulers of Mesopotamia and the lands surrounding it, the fall of kingdoms was often written in the language of cosmic justice. When fields failed to yield their harvests, when drought stretched across the land, or when enemy armies breached city walls, the people asked not simply how this could happen, but why. And more often than not, the answer was that a shadowed being, one of the dreaded demons of the night, had been unleashed. Chief among them in these tales of collapse was the haunting figure of Lamashtu, whose name was whispered with dread even in times of plenty. It is said that when empires weakened, she thrived. A kingdom in decline was like a wounded animal, and Lamashtu, like a predator, circled it with patient hunger. She was blamed for the infant mortality that rose sharply in famine years, for the madness of kings who made reckless decisions, and for the loss of divine favor that once seemed so secure. In some ways, she was not merely a demon haunting kings, but a living metaphor for decline itself. Where she walked, vitality withered. Where she gazed, harmony dissolved. We can see her shadow most clearly in the chronicles of the late Assyrian Empire. At its height, Assyria was a force unmatched in the Near East, with armies that crushed enemies and kings whose names echoed in fear across the land. Yet by the 7th century BCE, cracks began to spread in the empire's foundation. Babylon rose in rebellion, rival powers conspired against them, and within their own borders, unrest simmered. The great city of Nineveh, once believed to be invincible, fell in 612 BCE, its destruction so complete that for centuries its location was lost to the world. For the Assyrians themselves, such a downfall could not be explained by strategy alone. There had to be a deeper reason, a spiritual breach, an otherworldly enemy loosed upon their land. The texts suggest that the goddess Ishtar, once protector of kings, had withdrawn her favor, perhaps angered or neglected. In this vacuum, Lamashtu was believed to roam freely. Amulets from this period depict her more frequently, as if her influence was surging in the collective consciousness. Mothers clung to protective charms, priests invoked elaborate incantations, and yet still the tragedies mounted. One can almost imagine the scene in the final years, a palace filled with omens and desperate rituals, kings sleepless from nightmares, their children watched over by terrified attendants who whispered prayers against the demoness. The sound of drums and chanting would have filled the night as exorcists sought to drive her away. But the rituals no longer seemed to work as they once had. The old magic had lost its potency, or perhaps Lamashtu had grown stronger as the empire grew weaker. The fall of Nineveh was remembered not just as a military catastrophe but as the fulfillment of curses. Prophets of surrounding nations proclaimed that the bloodthirsty empire had finally reaped what it had sown. And in these narratives, the presence of a demon like Lamashtu would have been easy to weave. She was the embodiment of vengeance and suffering, the one who took what kings could not defend. For enemies of Assyria, her haunting of its rulers was poetic justice. For those within Assyria, it was tragedy made flesh. But the story does not end with Assyria. As power shifted to Babylon and later to Persia, the specter of Lamashtu continued to surface. Each empire carried within it the memory of collapse and the fear that it too could be undone by forces beyond control. Even in times of glory, there lingered an awareness that decline was inevitable, and with decline came the demoness who thrived on weakness. In this sense, she became a universal figure of downfall, a reminder that no throne was ever secure. The cycle is almost archetypal. A king rises, an empire flourishes, but hubris blinds the rulers. They forget the gods, neglect the rituals, or allow corruption to seep into their courts. Then the signs appear: illness, unrest, betrayal. And at the heart of these shadows, there is always talk of a demon moving silently through the kingdom. For Mesopotamia, that demon often bore the face of Lamashtu. Her haunting was not always literal. Sometimes, she was invoked as an explanation for deeper truths: the inevitability of mortality, the fragility of power, the instability of fortune. To say that Lamashtu haunted a king was to acknowledge that even the mightiest ruler was vulnerable to the forces of decay and ruin. The demoness thus served as both a spiritual terror and a philosophical lesson. And so we find ourselves at a turning point in the narrative of ancient kings. By tracing the shadow of Lamashtu across the centuries, we see not just the fears of individuals, but the anxieties of entire civilizations. Her image reveals how deeply people connected their fates with the invisible world. Every battle, every harvest, every birth and death was bound up in a struggle between gods, men, and demons. To live in this world was to accept that collapse could come not only from human error but from the unseen hands of creatures like her. This, perhaps, is her greatest power. Not merely the ability to take life, but the ability to shape the story of decline. For in every fall, in every ruin, there is the whisper of her name, a reminder that behind the curtain of politics and war, another drama was always unfolding, one that kings could never entirely control. Thus, as we leave this chapter, we do not merely witness the destruction of empires. We glimpse the haunting presence of the demoness who thrived on their downfall, who drank deeply of their despair, and who, in the end, became inseparable from the very idea of collapse itself. Her shadow lingers still, not only in ancient texts but in the unspoken fear that all things, no matter how mighty, must eventually fall. Fear is a curious inheritance. It does not vanish when the people who first felt it are gone. Instead, it lingers, handed down like a whispered warning from one generation to the next. The demoness Lamashtu may no longer be feared in the literal sense, for her name has faded into the quiet corners of ancient texts and half-buried amulets, yet her essence, her shadow, remains. She represents something timeless, the deep, universal dread of forces that cannot be tamed, of threats that strike where we are most vulnerable. In this way, her legacy endured long after the last Mesopotamian temple crumbled into dust. Even in modern times, when one might believe the age of demons is past, echoes of her can be found. The lullabies that mothers sing to soothe restless infants, the protective charms hung above a crib, the rituals of purification before birth, many of these practices trace their lineage back to the same primal fear that gave rise to the cult of protection against Lamashtu. A parent's fear of losing a child is one of the oldest and most enduring anxieties of humanity. Lamashtu was not only a figure of terror but also a symbol of that ever-present vulnerability, one that no advance of time or civilization can erase. Consider how her image survived through transformation. In some later traditions, her role was softened, reinterpreted, or reshaped. She was sometimes blurred with other female spirits, sometimes recast in folklore as a kind of restless night wanderer. Her direct worship or fear may have ended, but her essence, of a female figure who preys on the helpless, who haunts the vulnerable hours of life, surfaces again and again. In cultures far removed from Mesopotamia, one finds similar figures: the Greek Lamia, the Jewish Lilith, the Slavic Mora. They share the same features: nocturnal, predatory, often female, targeting children or the fragile boundaries between life and death. Whether by influence or parallel imagination, the archetype endured. This persistence shows us that Lamashtu was never just a Mesopotamian nightmare. She was an embodiment of something more archetypal, something rooted deep in the human psyche. Every culture has a story to explain sudden infant deaths, inexplicable illnesses, or the irrational madness of rulers. Where knowledge ends, imagination fills the void, and in that void lives the demoness. Thus, her endurance is not measured in temples or rituals but in the survival of her pattern, repeated endlessly in new names, new shapes, new mythologies. But beyond myth, her endurance lies also in the way she revealed the fragility of power itself. Kings, emperors, and rulers throughout history have sought to project an image of invincibility. Yet even the greatest of them, in their most private moments, feared what could not be conquered by sword or army. For the kings of Mesopotamia, Lamashtu was that reminder, that no matter how high their throne stood, there were forces below, forces unseen, that could undo everything. Her haunting was therefore a story about humility, about the limits of control, about the futility of believing that human hands alone could hold chaos at bay. This theme still resonates today. Modern leaders may not speak of demons in their palaces, yet the fear of collapse, of unseen forces tearing at the foundations of order, remains the same. Economic crises, pandemics, wars, these are the new demons, dressed in contemporary forms. But at their core, they awaken the same dread as Lamashtu once did, the realization that no matter how advanced we become, we remain vulnerable, fragile, and mortal. Her legacy endures in that recognition. What, then, is the lesson we are left with, in tracing her shadow across thousands of years? Perhaps it is that fear, when left unnamed, grows larger. The ancients named their fear Lamashtu, and by doing so, they gave themselves a way to fight it, with charms, incantations, and rituals. To us, her name is an echo, but the truth she represented is still alive. We, too, invent names for our fears, whether we call them misfortune, fate, or the invisible hand of history. The form may change, but the essence remains. In a way, the endurance of her story is also a kind of triumph. For though she was dreaded, though countless prayers were whispered against her, she was never forgotten. That survival, across millennia, is a power few kings or empires can claim. The walls of Nineveh are gone, Babylon's gardens have withered into legend, but Lamashtu's shadow still flickers in the corners of myth and memory. Fear kept her alive, and in that sense, she is immortal. And so, as the long night of Mesopotamian history fades into the quiet of forgotten ruins, her presence lingers. Not as a literal monster waiting in the dark, but as a symbol of what all humans carry with them, the knowledge that life is fragile, that power is temporary, and that the greatest threats are often unseen. When the ancients lay down to sleep, they whispered charms against her. And when we lie down to sleep today, though we may not know her name, we too carry the same unease, that sleep is a crossing, and that something might reach for us in the silence. Thus ends the tale of the demon that haunted ancient kings. Not merely a story of one fearsome figure, but a story of fear itself, how it moves, transforms, and endures. In listening, we are reminded not only of the fragility of empires but of the fragility within ourselves. And perhaps, in acknowledging that, we take a step closer to the truth that the ancients knew, that even in the presence of demons, life persists, hope endures, and memory keeps its watch.